Welcome to the Lies Disguised as Truth podcast. The greatest enemy of man is ignorance. It is the cause of all destruction.
Hey everybody, and welcome back. I think we all love a good holiday, right? But have you ever stopped to think about where some of those traditions come from?
I think a lot of times we just sort of take things at face value.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So today we're going to do a deep dive into the origins of Christmas traditions.
Should be fun.
Yeah, I think you might be surprised by some of the things we uncover.
I think so too.
All right, so first things first. We always like to lay out our sources, so we're looking at some historical and religious sources that shed some light on, how Christmas came to be what it is.
Right.
But one of the first things that just jumps out at me is that the date we celebrate Christmas, December 25th,
yeah,
that isn't actually the confirmed date for Jesus's birth.
No, it's not. The New Testament doesn't give us a specific date. And early Christians, they actually proposed all sorts of dates, from late March all the way to November.
Wow. So all over the place, really.
Yeah.
So then where did that December 25th date come from?
Well, like a lot of things in history, there's debate, among historians about that. But one theory is it kind of points back to this Roman festival called Saturnalia.
Saturnalia.
Yeah.
Oh.
And that was celebrated from December 17th to 25th.
Okay, so what was Saturnalia all about?
Well, you can imagine it was basically this week-long party.
Oh.
Yeah, with, feasting and drinking. And, the Romans would kind of reverse social norms for a bit.
Interesting.
Yeah. Courts were closed. They sort of relaxed the laws. People would exchange gifts, and they even had this position. They called it the Lord of Misrule.
The Lord of Misrule.
Yeah, and they'd appoint someone to basically preside over all this.
Okay, so that sounds a little chaotic.
Yeah, a little bit.
So how does all that tie into Christmas then?
Well, as you can imagine, when Christianity started to spread, the early church had a bit of a challenge on its hands.
Yeah, trying to convert people, I imagine.
Yeah, they wanted people to come to the new faith. But a lot of folks were really attached to their Roman customs,
I can see that.
including things like Saturnalia.
Yeah.
So what do you do?
Yeah, what do? You can't really just get rid of everything.
No, you can't, and they didn't. So they took a different approach.
Okay.
They essentially decided to adapt some of these customs.
Interesting.
Yeah, so they aligned Christmas with that existing celebration of Saturnalia, maybe make it a little more appealing, that transition to Christianity.
So instead of saying, hey, stop doing all this stuff, they're sort of like, well, let's work with it a little bit.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. It's like, meeting people where they are, culturally speaking, and trying to introduce those Christian beliefs. And it's a good example of how cultural and religious practices really blend together, over time.
Yeah, I mean, you see that throughout history, a lot of blending.
Definitely.
So that decision probably wasn't without controversy, though.
Oh, absolutely not. Some church leaders, they were really critical of that approach.
Really?
Yeah. They said, well, that's basically compromising with paganism. They thought it would dilute, the purity of Christian beliefs. And some even went so far as to accuse those who adopted those practices of sun worship.
Wow. And that's really interesting because December 25th also has a connection to pre-Christian sun worship, doesn't it?
Exactly. It does. In lots of ancient cultures, the winter solstice.
Yeah.
The shortest day of the year.
Right.
That was a big event. It marked that turning point, when the days start getting longer.
Yeah.
Symbolizing that rebirth of the sun.
Sure.
So for the Romans, December 25th,
yeah,
they celebrated that as the birthday of the unconquered sun.
The birthday of the unconquered sun.
Yeah,
Okay.
Sol Invictus. And it was a time for feasting and gift-giving and decorations, a lot like Christmas today, really.
So it sounds like that December 25th date for Christmas, that's kind of like a merging of Roman and pre-Christian traditions.
Exactly. You got it. It shows that interplay between the different cultural and religious influences. That really shaped how Christmas developed.
It's like a big historical puzzle. You're piecing together all these different elements to understand how this holiday came to be.
Yeah, it's a good analogy.
And the puzzle gets even more interesting when we start looking at the specific symbols we associate with Christmas.
Right.
Like the Christmas tree.
Yeah, the Christmas tree.
I mean, that's a huge part of the holiday. But it's not, it's not really a biblical symbol.
Not really. But the evergreen tree, that's been a symbol of rebirth and everlasting life in a lot of different cultures.
Interesting.
Yeah. The Romans, they decorated their homes with those evergreen boughs, during Saturnalia.
Okay, so how did that evergreen tree become a Christmas symbol?
That's a good question. And it's one of those things that evolved really gradually, over centuries.
Okay.
Early Christians actually didn't even use Christmas trees.
Right.
The tradition is thought to have started in Germany sometime during the Middle Ages, and it spread through Europe and then eventually, the rest of the world.
So the Christmas tree that we know and love today, that's got its roots in those pre-Christian pagan traditions.
It really does.
Wow. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
It makes you think, how many other Christmas traditions have origins that we just don't even realize? What about Santa Claus? He is Christmas in a lot of ways.
Yeah, he is.
But how did this figure even become associated with the holiday?
Well, Santa Claus, he's a really interesting mix of history and mythology and even commercialism. He's based in part on St. Nicholas,
Yeah.
this 4th century bishop.
I've heard of St. Nicholas.
He was known for, being really generous, especially towards children.
Yeah, I know that much. So how did he become the Santa Claus we know today?
So the story of St. Nicholas, over centuries, people added to it, they embellished it a little bit.
Sure.
And they blended it with those pagan folktales, especially, figures like Odin
Yeah.
and Thor, figures that were associated with giving gifts and winter and travel.
Oh, I see. So Santa Claus, he's a product of Christian and pagan influence.
He is.
Wow. That's amazing. But the transformation didn't end there, right?
No, it didn't stop there.
Yeah.
In the 19th century, American writers and artists, they started creating this more modern image of Santa. Jolly, bearded, dressed in red. And then, the 20th century came along, Coca-Cola.
Right.
With all their advertising campaigns, they solidified that image that we see today.
Yeah.
A jolly, red-suited Santa, white beard, rosy cheeks.
It's amazing how a figure from Christian history can transform into this global icon, shaped by mythology and folklore and even commercial interests.
Yeah.
It makes you think, what other hidden stories are behind, the traditions that we just got to take for granted?
It really does.
It's like there's so much to uncover.
Yeah. Yeah, it really does. It makes you kind of rethink things a bit. We think of Christmas as, joy and family and generosity, but when you start to see these historical layers, it adds a whole new dimension.
Yeah, it's like peeling back the layers of an onion. You're revealing this complex history. It's fascinating and kind of unsettling at the same time.
Right.
But, we've only scratched the surface here. The sources we're looking at, they get into some pretty intense theological debates.
They do, yeah.
About Christmas. Some Christian groups, particularly fundamentalist ones, they take a pretty hard line.
Yeah, they do.
Against Christmas.
Yeah.
So why is that? It is a celebration of Jesus' birth, isn't it?
Well, and that's the interesting part. They argue that, those pagan origins of Christmas, those make it totally incompatible with true Christian worship. They think, God just condemns mixing pagan practices with Christian belief.
Oh, so they see it as a compromise.
Exactly. They say it undermines the purity of the Christian faith.
Yeah, they point to passages in the Bible that warn against, idolatry and the worship of false gods.
Yeah, exactly. They say by adopting those customs and symbols, the church was basically condoning practices that went against God's will.
Yeah. But didn't those early church leaders have good intentions?
Yeah.
They were trying to make Christianity more accessible to people who were used to those pagan traditions.
Yeah, and that's true. It is a super complex historical situation, There are no easy answers.
Right.
But these groups, they're like, no. Good intentions don't change the fact that Christmas is fundamentally a pagan holiday.
Okay, so they think any attempt to make it Christian is basically useless.
Exactly, yeah.
So what are some of the specific traditions that they object to?
Well, they take issue with a lot of the core symbols.
Okay.
For example, they point to Bible passages that condemn decorating a tree with silver and gold and putting it up in your house.
So they're talking about the Christmas tree.
The Christmas tree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I never thought of it that way.
Sure.
What about Santa Claus?
Santa, too, yeah. They say, well, he's got those links to figures like Odin and Thor, and they see those, Santa's attributes. Knowing if you've been naughty or nice, rewarding good behavior, they see that as kind of a counterfeit of, divine judgment.
Okay, so they're not just focused on the pagan origins, but also the theological implications of these traditions.
Yeah. they think those can distract from the true meaning of Christmas.
Yeah.
You know, the birth of Jesus,
Right.
that celebration of his life and teachings. They say, you know, all the focus on gift giving and decoration, Santa, that overshadows the spiritual side.
It sounds like they're arguing for a simpler approach.
Yeah, much more biblically focused.
Yeah, focused on the Bible.
Yeah, they think that true worship, it has to be based on what the Bible teaches. And anything else is like this compromise that, you know, goes against God.
It's a different way of thinking about it, for sure. It makes me kind of re-examine my own assumptions about Christmas. Do they offer any alternatives to those traditional celebrations?
They do. They really emphasize those biblical festivals, you know.
Yeah.
The holy days, the ones that are outlined in the Old Testament, they think those are the true celebrations. You know, the ones that God ordained.
Okay, so like, what are some examples of those biblical holy days?
Well, they observe things like Passover, which remembers the Israelites leaving Egypt, and Pentecost, which celebrates, you know, getting the Holy Spirit, and the Feast of Tabernacles, which remembers, like, you know, their time wandering in the wilderness.
So they see those festivals as like more in line with God's will than Christmas is.
Yeah, exactly. They believe those celebrations, they're rooted in, you know, God's covenant with his people.
Wow.
They say it offers a deeper understanding of, you know, his plan.
For humanity.
Yeah. And they say Christmas, you know, with its focus on the birth of Jesus, that's only part of the story.
It's definitely a different perspective. And I can see how it fits with their belief in the Bible, you know.
Exactly. It's not just about celebrating different days. It's about having a different mindset, you know, one that says we need to obey God's commands. We find those in the Bible.
Yeah. It's a challenging viewpoint, especially for those of us who grew up with traditional Christmas. But it does make you stop and think about where our traditions come from, what meaning we give them.
Yeah, definitely.
But some of those arguments against Christmas, they go beyond just the pagan origins and even biblical interpretations. Some sources even suggest like a darker side to it.
Oh, you mean the idea that Christmas is somehow connected to, like, Satan?
Yeah, exactly. Like some sources say Christmas is this trick, a way for like Satan to lead people astray.
That's a pretty big claim. What evidence do they have for that?
Well, they focus on the materialism, the self-indulgence that often comes with Christmas, right?
Yeah.
They say they focus on gifts and decorations and, you know, too much food. That creates greed and materialism. And that distracts from like spiritual values.
I mean, you can see how they would make that connection. Christmas has become super commercialized. Oh,
Yeah.
all the pressure to buy, make it perfect.
It's overwhelming.
Yeah.
And they even go further. They say some Christmas symbols have like hidden meanings, you know, that connect to satanic themes.
Really?
Like they say Santa is an anagram for Satan,
Oh, wow.
and that Santa is like a representation of the devil.
That's a pretty strong interpretation. I don't think most people who celebrate Christmas would see it that way.
No, definitely not. But these groups, they believe those hidden meanings are real. They say it's a subtle form of like spiritual deception.
But they see it as like a trick.
Yeah, like Satan is using Christmas to pull people away from God
Wow.
and into this world of material things and false beliefs.
Yeah, that's an interesting take. It makes you think.
Right. And they're really concerned about the effect of those, you know, lies on children. They say the Santa myth, that sets kids up for disappointment. And it could even hurt their faith in God.
I can see their point. It's tricky, you know, trying to keep that magic of Christmas for kids, but also make sure they understand what's real and what's fantasy.
Yeah.
That moment when they realize Santa isn't real, that can be tough.
Yeah, it can be. And these groups, they say it's a betrayal to teach kids to believe in something that isn't real.
Yeah.
They think it leads to cynicism and makes it harder to accept, like, you know, spiritual truths later on.
It's a valid concern, and it's something, you know, parents and teachers need to be aware of.
For sure. How do we approach traditions like that in a way that, you know, keeps that sense of wonder but doesn't compromise honesty?
Right. It's a tough question.
It is. These sources definitely push us to think about the messages we send to kids and what impact those traditions will have in the long run.
Definitely. It's about being thoughtful, intentional, both in how we celebrate and in how we explain those traditions to kids.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot to digest, huh? I mean, we started off just talking about, you know, where Christmas traditions come from. And now we're talking about ancient Rome and theological debates and even like, you know, Satan.
It's been quite a journey. Yeah.
Yeah.
It really makes you realize, you know, traditions, they're not simple.
Yeah.
There's all these layers of, history, cultural influences, and even different interpretations that clash with each other.
It's like we said, that onion. You peel back the layers and you get this complexity that you didn't really expect.
Right. And it might be unsettling for some people, but I think it's pretty fascinating. It shows us, beliefs and practices. They're always changing. They're shaped by all these things over time.
So where do we go from here? We've heard arguments against Christmas, from the historical side, from the theological side. Some people think it's a nice celebration of Jesus's birth. Some think it's a pagan holiday disguised as a Christian one. And then there are those who say it's a tool of Satan.
It's a whole range of opinions. It really comes down to what you believe personally. I don't think there's a right or wrong answer.
And I think that's important to remember. We're not here to tell people what to believe or how to celebrate. We just wanted to explore the meaning behind Christmas, look at where those traditions come from, and show the different theological ideas about it.
Yeah, and hopefully it got people thinking,
Yeah.
about what they believe and how they celebrate. Do they celebrate without really thinking about it? Do they embrace it even though it's got this, complicated history? Or do they reject it completely because of what they understand about the Bible?
It's a personal choice. And we're not judging anyone. The important thing is to make a choice that feels right for you, that matches your values and your beliefs.
Yeah, I agree. And, I think this also shows us how important it is to respect other people's views, even if we don't agree with them.
For sure.
We can learn from each other, even when we disagree.
Yeah, and having those conversations, even about tough topics, it can help us understand more and grow in our faith. So as we wrap up this deep dive into the pagan roots of Christmas, what's the main takeaway for our listeners?
I'd say the biggest thing to remember is don't be afraid to ask those questions. Challenge what you think you know and look for different perspectives. Traditions are powerful, but we shouldn't just follow them blindly. We need to look at our own beliefs and make sure they match what we value and what we believe is true.
And even if this leaves you with more questions than answers, that's okay. It's the exploring that matters. And hey, maybe it'll even start some good conversations, around the dinner table this year.
Yeah, that's a good point. After all, isn't that what the holidays are about? Connecting with people you love, telling stories, thinking about what really matters.
That's a great way to put it. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. I hope you found it, interesting and thought-provoking, and maybe even a little fun. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep searching for the truth wherever it takes you.
Thank you for listening. Before you leave, be sure to hit that like button, click subscribe, and turn on notifications to not miss an episode as the Lies Disguised as Truth podcast. OC46KJV. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. Because thou hast rejected knowledge, I will also reject thee.